Hello and welcome to another Top Grades Made Easy video. Here you're going to learn to analyse Fred, but as the antithesis to Scrooge. This means the opposite to Scrooge, and it gives you a structural reason why Dickens has included Fred in the novel, and that leads you to the top grades. Dickens is also interested in the genetic link between Fred and Scrooge, because this makes the change that Scrooge undergoes at the end much more plausible, because he shares the same DNA as Fred. Obviously, Dickens wouldn't have known about DNA, but he would have known about genetics. And so the happy Scrooge that we get at the end of stage 5 is a mirror image of the happy Fred we get at the beginning of stage 1. So the antithesis then becomes the mirror image. Scrooge turns into an older version of Fred. So Fred is both Scrooge's antithesis and his role model. When they speak about Christmas, he says, "Though it has never put a scrap of gold or silver in my pocket, I believe that it has done me good and will do me good, and I say, God bless it." Dickens uses this to teach Scrooge the lesson that life is much, much more than an accumulation of profit. More than that, Fred shows that we can't measure the worth of the really valuable things in life through money. The idea that Fred is Scrooge's opposite is deliberately highlighted through contrast. Scrooge tells Fred, "You're poor enough," implying that only wealth can bring happiness. Fred replies, "You're rich enough," implying that holding on to your wealth without spending it on others will bring no happiness at all. For Fred, this happiness and joy is to be found in the family. This is the lesson that Scrooge will learn when he visits Fred's family with the ghost of Christmas present. Dickens deliberately populates the scene with lots of guests all having fun with Fred and his wife. Fred appears to be highly romantic. Here he is with his friend Topper, and they've set up a game of blind man's buff where Topper is supposed to be blindfolded, but Fred seems to have arranged the blindfold in such a way that Topper can easily find but Fred's wife's sister. They are going to flirt outrageously behind the curtain, as suggested by the ghostly narrator. So Fred embodies the life that Scrooge could have had if he had chosen to marry Belle. It's also important to Dickens that we see this scene through the eyes of Christmas present, because Fred is used symbolically here as a literal Christmas present for Scrooge. In fact, it's worth asking why Dickens called the ghost of Christmas present at all. He could have been called Christmas Day or Christmas Now, or had a weird title like The Ghost of Christmas Yet to Come. But no, he chooses the word present because of its associated meaning with present, and therefore Scrooge receives the present of Fred's party as a gift, because family is the gift that Dickens wants to give all of us at Christmas. However, at the beginning, Scrooge is terrified by the idea of a family. If you've watched my video on Scrooge and patterns of attachment, you will understand why, how he simply fears loss much too much to trust the instinct of love. This is why we get a very strange exchange when Fred first invites Scrooge round to Christmas dinner. Instead of answering Fred's invitation, Scrooge has this bizarre conversation with him. "Why did you get married?" said Scrooge. "Because I fell in love." "Because you fell in love," growled Scrooge, as if that were the only thing in the world more ridiculous than a Merry Christmas. "Good afternoon." This focus on love and marriage helps us understand that Scrooge has always been afraid of feeling love because he's been rejected by Belle. This also implies that the only reason to marry is for financial gain. This is why Belle rejected Scrooge. She realised he would bitterly resent her because he was marrying her without a dowry. A dowry was a sum paid by the father to the future husband in order literally to take his daughter off his hands, to stop her being a financial burden on the father, and therefore the husband was paid an amount to take the daughter away. This, of course, was a terrible sexist tradition in a patriarchal society, but it would have been a tradition amongst the middle classes. At this stage, when Belle is engaged to Scrooge, neither of them are middle class. They're too poor for any kind of significant dowry. So when Scrooge asks this question, he's really asking Fred, why on earth would you marry for love when you could also have married for money? Dickens makes this really explicit when the ghost of Christmas past takes him back to this moment where Belle split from him. Our contract is an old one. It was made when we were both poor and content to be so, until in good season we could improve our worldly fortune by our patient industry, says Belle. But now she releases him from this contract. The contract, of course, refers to a dowry. She's pointing out that when they were both poor, there was no real dowry, and therefore Scrooge was earning nothing by marrying her, and she suggests that he would rather marry a woman with more money. Of course, she is completely wrong. Scrooge never marries another woman, rich or poor. Instead, he falls into this habit of abandonment produced by his pattern of attachment. Anyway, that level of sophistication you can find in my Scrooge video. Let's now get back to Fred. Fred has also married for love, as we saw, without a good dowry or contract. On the one hand, he is the antithesis of Scrooge here by marrying for love. However, Scrooge was much like Fred when Scrooge was young. This implies that there is hope for him to become like Fred again. So this scene with Bella and the scene with Fred being asked why he married is to invite us to imagine that the happiness of Fred can become Scrooge's happiness at the end, because Scrooge was like Fred when he was young, as Fred is. Another aspect of Scrooge's fear of abandonment is the relationship he had with his sister Fran. She has been a loving saviour to him in the past, but we're about to discover that she too has died and therefore symbolically abandoned. So we also get a sense that Scrooge can't face Fred because he reminds Scrooge of his dead sister Fan. First his mother and then his sister abandoned him by dying. The ghost tiptoes around this subject really tactfully and cautiously because he knows it might be painful. He says, she had, as I think, children. Of course, the ghost would know this full well. The ghost sees and understands everything. That's part of the supernatural element that we're drawn to. But he pretends as though he doesn't know that Fan had children. Now, this is important because it means that Fred has also been abandoned. There are no brothers and sisters present when we meet Fred at his party. All these people are relatives of his wife and his friends. Fred is an only child, just like Scrooge. They have both lost their siblings. This terrible tragedy in Fred's life of losing his brothers and sisters has not made him bitter and fearful, as it has Scrooge. So again, Dickens is offering Fred as an alternative vision of what Scrooge could be like. This is also important when you meet people who say that Scrooge's conversion isn't very realistic and we would never believe in it anyway. Dickens is really careful to include real life details like this, like the high rate of infant mortality, as background information to suggest that he is writing about a real world. All right, he's using a fable and a supernatural ghost story to do it, but he also wants to make a social point about how we should behave in society, so the society he describes is very much real. We can also sense Scrooge's fear of kindness as a physical weakness. So the ghost's description of Fan as always a delicate creature whom a breath might have withered, said the ghost, but she had a large heart. The large heart here suggests her kindness. It's a symbol of it, but it also suggests that her large heart was too great for her frail and delicate body. In other words, Scrooge associates the act of loving and being kind with the probability of early death. And this is another reason that he becomes a miser and refuses to show love. So we can imagine that this relationship with Fan is to show us that Scrooge fears being abandoned again. And he fears that every time he sees Fan's son, Fred. Now, Fred also allows us to emphasize a lot of the comedy in A Christmas Carol. So we have this contrast of Fred's humour with Scrooge's misanthropy. Misanthropy means hatred of mankind or of other people. This is what Fred says. "He has given us plenty of merriment, I'm sure," said Fred, "and it would be ungrateful not to drink his health. Here is a glass of mulled wine ready to our hand, and I say, Uncle Scrooge, a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year to the old man, wherever he is." So we can see from this that he actually enjoys provoking Scrooge. He knows what's going to happen when he goes round to wish his uncle a Merry Christmas. And he's hoping to hear, no doubt, loads of these stereotypical phrases that Scrooge must come out with every Christmas, like bar humbug and boiling people's heads for suggesting that they should have a Merry Christmas when they're not wealthy enough to do so. When Fred proposes a toast in this way, we can see that he regularly shares stories of Scrooge's cantankerous personality in order to make his wife and his friends laugh. Obviously, he isn't just making fun of Scrooge. He does genuinely return every year to try to improve Scrooge's view of humanity and of his employee Bob, as we shall see. And he also wants Scrooge to be able to enjoy his own wealth and his own life. But he still enjoys making fun of the old man, and of course, as readers, we share in that. So we align ourselves to Fred's view. And we could definitely argue that Fred represents Dickens' view. He is a proxy for Dickens' ideas. Fred also realises that Scrooge's attempts to protect himself from feelings of love and loss actually damage him, so that he pities Scrooge. "I am sorry for Scrooge. I couldn't be angry with him if I tried. Who suffers by his ill whims? Himself, always." Fred realises, far before Ebenezer Scrooge does, that being stingy and cruel causes more suffering to the miser than to those around him. Indeed, in the beginning of the novella, Scrooge is lonely, cold, poorly fed, and stingy with himself. His clear unhappiness in life contrasts with those around him, like Fred and Bob Cratchit, who are still able to find happiness, love, and joy despite not having wealth. This is really important in Victorian society and in Dickens' view of the world. So Dickens needs us to know that Fred is not financially motivated. He's not looking for any kind of present from Scrooge when he visits him. Fred has to start from the perspective of an inheritor. I want nothing from you. I ask nothing of you. Why cannot we be friends? But I have made the trial in homage to Christmas, and I'll keep my Christmas humour to the last. So, a Merry Christmas, Uncle. Dickens gives Fred these words because he wants his readers to reject the idea of personal fortune and the desire for wealth. It's also really important that Dickens' readers don't suspect that Fred has an ulterior motive, in other words, to gain an inheritance from his uncle who, after all, is near death. His partner died only 7 years before. And so it's a reasonable expectation that the nephew, as Scrooge's only surviving relative, is going to inherit Scrooge's fortune. So Fred also has to make clear to Scrooge that he's not interested in that fortune. Next, Dickens uses Fred to repeat Christmas 3 times to let his readers know that Fred is his spokesperson. After all, this is a Christmas carol, so Fred represents Dickens. Some context for you. Dickens' books are often obsessed with the idea of inheritance, and in Great Expectations, one of his most famous books, the lead character Pip grows up desperate to become a gentleman, and he gets an inheritance which allows him to do that, but obviously, this being a novel, it ends for him in disaster, and he eventually rejects all his wealth and the idea of becoming a gentleman. So we can use this reference to show how Dickens is violently opposed to the idea of inheriting money, or at least relying on that inheritance, rather than enjoying life through your own efforts. Another piece of context for you. Dickens was an entirely self-made man. He grew up from poverty, worked from the young age of 12, and supported a family of 10 children, although I think he only had 5 at the time of writing Christmas Carol. But the point remains, he was definitely in favour of a man making his own way in life through the skill of his own labour. And Fred is a character who believes and behaves in the same way as Dickens. Dickens also uses Fred to instruct us with his message of how we should behave with our wealth. His wealth is of no use to him. He don't do any good with it. He don't make himself comfortable with it. He hasn't the satisfaction of thinking that he's ever going to benefit us with it. Here we can see that Fred realises that generosity would make Scrooge so much happier. By giving to others, you increase your own happiness. But of course, Scrooge can't realise that. Dickens does, which is why he gives that perspective to Fred. Now, in the same conversation, Fred's perspective is not all about us, himself and his family. It's actually about Bob Cratchit. He tells his family and guests about the reason he has gone to visit his uncle to wish him a Merry Christmas. If it only puts him in the vein to leave his poor clerk £50, that's something. And I think I shook him yesterday. Here Dickens wants his readers not to just focus on their own families, but also on the people they employ. Many of his readers, of course, would run small businesses. Some would run large businesses with employees. However, even more of his readers would have domestic servants. Once family income rose above about £150 per year, they would start to employ maids and cooks and other female working staff. Domestic service, it was called. Scrooge, of course, is unlike his readers because he is far too much of a miser to bother employing anyone to look after his household or prepare his food. But a huge number of them would have had their own domestic staff. 50 years later, in 1891, the census records that 1.3 million domestic servants were at work in Britain. So really, Dickens uses Fred to make his readers ask themselves, should I be much more generous with the people who work for me? Now, another easy way to get top marks when you're writing about character is to be able to link them to a structure. And in the case of A Christmas Carol, the structure is circular. If you should happen, says the narrator, by any unlikely chance to know a man more blessed in a laugh than Scrooge's nephew, all I can say is I should like to know him too. Introduce him to me and I'll cultivate his acquaintance. Obviously, this emphasis on laughter shows what an ideal human being Fred is. But that description is also there to give us the circular structure when we get to stave 5 and we find Scrooge laughing and crying in the same breath now that he is a changed man. Laughter and Fred are also associated with Scrooge in another way. Remember when he said to his family and friends that he thought he had shaken Scrooge? Well, this is their reaction. It was their turn to laugh now at the notion of his shaking Scrooge, but being thoroughly good-natured and not much caring what they laughed at, so that they laughed at any rate, he encouraged them in their merriment and passed the bottle joyously. Well, that moment is repeated at the end of stave 5. So we come back to the idea of a circular structure, where the narrator describes Scrooge. His own heart laughed, and that was quite enough for him. This laughter is a suitable response for Scrooge to the way other people laugh at him for suddenly giving up his miserly ways and becoming a generous father figure to Tiny Tim and a giver to charity. Some people laughed to see the alteration in him, but he let them laugh and little heeded them, for he was wise. And it's important to remember that this link with the laughter shows that Fred shares that wisdom. More than that, it suggests that Fred has taught this wisdom to his Uncle Scrooge. So Fred is a pivotal character. And I think we can also see in this symbolic description of how Scrooge's heart laughed a deliberate reference back to Fred's mother, Scrooge's sister Fan, but she had a large heart. Now, Scrooge has that large heart too, which is the genetic link back to Fred. Fred's large heart has given Scrooge a large heart and restored him, not just so that he's great to society by becoming a contributor. No, he has restored Scrooge's self-worth, his whole sense of well-being and purpose, and given him this rejuvenated start, an old man who is beginning again like a baby. So whereas at the beginning of the novel, Fred is the antithesis to Scrooge, we have now seen how Scrooge has become the mirror image of Fred. Fred is therefore pivotal to the change, and therefore to delivering Shakespeare's message. And therefore, Fred is instrumental in delivering Dickens' message and point of view. Now, the voiceovers of these videos, once I've finished them, will form the basis of a guide on Amazon. This is a sample of the guides I already have out. Christmas Carol is in the making, but whatever you're studying, the chances are I've got a brilliant guide on it. But if you don't like the feeling of paper and you still want great grades, watch the next video in the series, appearing soon. By which I mean now. Click on it somewhere, it's here. Or, go and buy a guide.